Welcome to your 10th video on ancient Rome and part 2 on Roman architecture. So we're continuing where we left off in the last video and taking a look at many of the different types of Roman structures. So let's take a look at aqueducts now. Now, Roman aqueducts were an amazing feat of engineering, and what that allowed the Romans to do was to bring water in from a great distance. And so that allowed them to build a city pretty much wherever they wanted to. They could just pipe in the water via the aqueducts. Now, this aqueduct you're looking at here is one of the most famous aqueducts. It's the Pont du Gard, which is located in the south of France. Now, if you can imagine, this aqueduct was constructed almost entirely without mortar. So basically, each stone had to be precisely cut and then fit perfectly together to form the entire structure. So what the Romans could do is bring water in from distant sources, and this allowed them to supply all of their cities. And in those cities, they could supply public baths, fountains, and even set up complex sewage systems. Now, obviously, this was before the days of electrical pumps. So the aqueducts moved water through gravity alone. And so they were always on a slight downward gradient to move the water. Okay, now let's look at the ancient Roman basilica. Now, these are not like the later basilicas that were associated with Christianity. The early Roman basilicas were large public buildings that served as a place where business matters could be handled. So again, the early Roman basilicas had no religious function at all. And these were often close to the Roman forums. And so that brings me to the next slide, the ancient Roman forum. And of course, most Roman cities had a forum, and this is the most famous forum, the one, of course, in ancient Rome itself. And the forums always consisted of several governmental buildings that were usually at the center of the city. And this would have been the center for Roman public life. And any public speeches would have been given here, and all of the victorious Roman generals would have had their triumphal procession always end up at the Roman forum. And it was also the center of all commercial affairs. And the forum today in ancient Rome was located between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. And we always hear about the 7 hills of Rome, and those are the 2 most famous hills, the Palatine and Capitoline hill. Okay, let's move on. Now we come to chariot racing. And the Romans loved their chariot racing, as we've seen in many Roman movies, the most famous of which is, of course, in the movie Ben-Hur. And if you've never seen that scene, I recommend you go watch that scene at least, because it's an amazing scene. And it will give you some idea of just how dangerous chariot racing was. But as I said, the ancient Romans loved it, and they built these very large chariot racing stadiums throughout their empire. Now, the most famous is the Circus Maximus, and that, of course, was located right in Rome, very near the Forum. And you can see it here today. But this is only a shadow of its former self. This would have been a very large stadium that could accommodate, if you can imagine this in ancient times, 150,000 spectators. It was about 2,000 feet in length and around 380 feet in width. And this was the largest stadium in ancient Rome. Now, the Romans would usually throw public games here when there was some sort of religious festival going on. So games are usually connected with religious festivals. And they were always sponsored by the leading Romans. And it was usually to impress the Roman people. And so Julius Caesar would often throw games to impress his various fans. And he had many of them. Now, the duration of these games could last one day or could be held over several days, with chariot racing, athletics, beast hunts, and even gladiator contests. So they didn't just hold gladiatorial contests at the Colosseum, they could be held in other stadiums as well. And there was often a parade of the participants at the beginning of the games, kind of like they do in the Olympics, where all of the participants are introduced. But unlike today's Olympic Games, these events could be a matter of life and death, as you've seen in many of the Roman movies where they have contests. Okay, let's take a look at the Roman villas and palaces. And these were essentially Roman country houses that were built for the upper class. Now, this occurred both during the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. And this picture here on the left was one of Hadrian's villas. Now, Hadrian, of course, was an emperor during the Roman Empire. And he didn't just have one palace, he had around 12 palaces, if you can imagine that. And so what's that famous line from that Mel Brooks movie? It's good to be the king. And boy, was that true in ancient Rome. Now, these usually were permanently occupied by servants who might have been slaves, but they generally ran the estate. Since again this was essentially a country house, it was only seasonally occupied. And usually the wealthy Romans wanted to escape the summer heat, and so in order to do that, they would retreat to one of their villas. Many of these villas were lavishly furnished. As you can see there in that pool at Hadrian's villa, there were several sculptures surrounding the pool. And many of the villas had mosaic floors and elaborate frescoes. They might even have olive groves, and of course there were always the usual fountains and pools. And they could also throw lavish parties for their numerous guests. And boy, that would have been quite a feast to attend in those days. Now, if we take a look at this villa right here, this is an artist's illustration of Diocletian's retirement palace. Now, Diocletian was an emperor in the late Roman Empire, and he had the distinction of actually being able to retire. Now, usually Roman emperors either died in office or they were assassinated. But Diocletian actually was able to retire, and that's because he did quite a bit for the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was on the brink of destruction, and he brought it back and restored it to much of its greatness. And so just take a look at this palace. I mean, who wouldn't want to live here? And this is one of the best preserved Roman palaces. So if you were going to visit one palace, this would be it. And then there were the Roman baths, and many of these were for public bathing. And the best preserved Roman bath is in Bath, England, appropriately named. Now, if you take a look at this picture on the right, the Roman baths themselves are below the modern street level. Everything above those columns is from more modern times. Now, these baths were usually connected to a hot spring, so that provided the fresh water and the heat needed for the baths. And so as you can see, there's a couple styles here. There's a circular bath on the left, and then there's this more rectangular grand bath on the right. And if you go to England anytime soon, you should go to these. This is one of the most visited places in England. I think they get around 1 million visitors per year. And of course, there is the Roman Triumphal Arch. And during ancient Roman times, successful Roman generals were always given a parade, and the procession would always move under the arch that was dedicated to their numerous victories. In this case, this is the Arch of Titus. And many of these are very well preserved in Rome and in other cities. Now, I think I read somewhere that you needed to kill 5,000 people in order to get one of these arches. That was one of the requirements. So that's just the starting point. I think Caesar at one point boasted he killed 1 million people. So you can see there weren't a lot of morals in those days. If you were an enemy of Rome, they had no qualms about slaughtering entire villages or even cities. Okay, let's take a look at the Roman walls. And that picture on the left is of the Servian Wall, which was the original wall that surrounded the ancient city of Rome. And there are sections of this that still exist today, though many of the gates no longer exist. Now, this was a defensive barrier that was constructed around the 4th century BC, and it was likely as a result of the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC. And the Romans, as they always did, learned from their lessons and decided to build a barrier around their city to prevent any future invasions. And this would serve them well during the Punic Wars when Hannibal became a direct threat to Rome itself. Now, some of the best preserved Roman walls are in Spain, and you can see them on this picture on the right. These walls are extremely well preserved, and there's actually a walkway on top of these walls that allow even visitors to walk the entire length of the wall. So if you want to see the best preserved Roman walls, this would be the place to go. Okay, and this is the final slide, and this is the Library of Celsus, which is located in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And I actually visited this place, and it's unbelievable. It's an entire Roman city that's being excavated even today. And so many of these ruins are very well preserved. This library was built to store 12,000 scrolls. Okay, that is going to wrap it up for the Prelude series on ancient Rome. In the next video, we will start from scratch and begin to deal with the Roman kings, the first rulers of Rome.